Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can save a man's soul. Eli Boone had spent 20 long years drowning in silence, haunted by the son he lost to war and the wife who couldn't bear to look at him anymore. At 62, the giant of a man had nothing left but an empty ranch and painful memories that cut deeper than winter wind. Then came the auction day that changed everything forever. When a trembling puppy appeared in a burlap sack, quite unwanted and afraid, something stirred deep in Eli's weathered heart. $1 was all it took to buy that scared little creature. But could a broken-down cowboy and a forgotten dog truly heal each other's wounds? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something really extra special for you. The alarm clock beside Eli Boone's bed hadn't worked in 3 years, but he still woke every morning at 5:30 sharp. His body kept time like an old soldier, even though there wasn't much worth getting up for anymore. The ranch house creaked around him as he pulled on his worn Levi's and the same flannel shirt he'd been wearing for the better part of a week. Outside his bedroom window, the Colorado high plains stretched endlessly toward mountains that caught the first pale light of dawn. Coffee first. Always coffee first. The routine helped him pretend there was purpose to his days. The kitchen felt too big for one man, with its long oak table that once seated a family and countertops that Sarah had picked out with such care 30 years ago. Before everything went to hell, before Marcus decided he needed to prove himself in some godforsaken desert halfway around the world, Eli poured himself a mug from the pot he'd set to brew the night before and walked to the living room window. 2,000 acres of grassland rolled away from the house, dotted with scrub oak and bordered by fence lines that needed mending. He used to run 300 head of cattle on this land. Now he kept maybe 30, just enough to maintain his agricultural exemption and give himself something to do, besides drink and remember. The display case caught his eye like it did every morning, sitting on the mantel above the cold fireplace. Inside, perfectly arranged on deep blue velvet, lay Marcus's Purple Heart and Bronze Star. The medals gleamed in the morning light, polished by grief and regret rather than pride. 24 years old when that roadside bomb took him. 24 years of watching his boy grow into a man, only to lose him to a war that never should have been his fight. Eli turned away from the medals, as he always did, and headed outside. The barn needed mucking, the fence posts along the north pasture needed replacing, and the tractor had been making that grinding noise again. Busy work. Anything to keep his hands moving and his mind from wandering down those dark paths that led nowhere good. The town of Copper Creek lay 5 miles down the county road, and from his porch, Eli could see its water tower rising above the cottonwoods like a rusted sentinel. Population 847. According to the sign that hadn't been updated since the last census. In reality, the number was probably closer to 600 now. Young folks kept leaving for Denver or Colorado Springs, chasing jobs and opportunities that small towns couldn't provide. The old-timers like himself hung on out of stubbornness or because they had nowhere else to go. Main Street told the story of a place slowly dying. Jensen's Hardware had closed 2 summers ago when old Pete Jensen finally admitted defeat to the big box stores in the county seat. The movie theater had been boarded up since the early 90s. Even Murphy's Bar and Grill, the social heart of the community for as long as anyone could remember, only opened Thursday through Saturday now. Progress, they called it, but it looked an awful lot like decline to Eli. He'd been born on this ranch, same as his father and his father before him. The Boone family had homesteaded this land in 1887, back when cattle drives and Indian raids were still fresh memories. 3 generations of men had worked this soil, raised families in this house, and been buried in the small cemetery behind the Methodist church in town. Eli had always assumed Marcus would be the 4th generation, would take over the ranch and carry on the family name. Instead, there was just Eli, 62 years old, and feeling every day of it in his bones. His hair had gone completely gray in the 5 years since Marcus died, and his 6'4" frame had begun to stoop slightly, as if the weight of solitude was slowly crushing him down. People in town still called him the Giant sometimes, remembering when he'd been the star of the high school football team, and later the man who could throw a full-grown steer to the ground with his bare hands at the county fair. Those days felt like someone else's life now. The divorce papers had arrived 6 months after the funeral. Sarah couldn't stand to look at him anymore, couldn't bear the way he'd sit at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, couldn't handle his refusal to talk about Marcus or the war or anything that mattered. She'd packed her things one Tuesday morning while he was out checking cattle and left a note on the kitchen counter next to the coffee pot. "I can't watch you die of grief, Eli, I won't." She'd moved to Grand Junction to live with her sister, got a job at the hospital there. They'd spoken maybe a dozen times in the 5 years since, brief phone calls about business matters or the awkward exchange of birthday cards. She tried to get him to sell the ranch, move somewhere smaller, start over. But this land was all he had left of the life he'd built, all he had left of Marcus. The boy had loved this place, had talked about bringing his own children here someday to ride horses and learn about cattle and grow up understanding the value of hard work. Now there was just silence and empty space and the constant ache of what might have been. Martha Henderson lived on the neighboring ranch, a widow herself who'd lost her husband to cancer 3 years back. She stopped by most afternoons with some excuse, borrowed sugar, help with a stubborn gait, gossip from town. Really, she was checking on him, making sure he was still breathing and hadn't drunk himself to death or put a gun to his head. He appreciated her concern, even if he couldn't bring himself to say so. Martha was one of the few people who still remembered him as something other than the broken-down old man he'd become. "You need to get out more," she'd tell him over coffee at his kitchen table. "Join the coffee group at the diner. Come to church social on Sundays. There's life beyond this ranch, Eli Boone." But he couldn't explain to her that the ranch was the only place where Marcus still felt real. In town, people looked at him with pity or careful politeness, tiptoeing around the subject of his loss like it might be contagious. Here, among the fields and fence lines where the boy had learned to ride and work cattle, Eli could almost hear his voice on the wind, could almost see him coming up the drive after a day at high school, backpack slung over his shoulder, and that crooked grin that reminded everyone of his mother. The financial pressure didn't help matters. Medical bills from Sarah's father's final illness, the costs of Marcus's funeral, and 5 years of declining cattle prices had eaten away at the savings account his grandfather had started in 1952. The bank in town had been patient, probably more patient than they should have been. But Eli knew their forbearance wouldn't last forever. Property taxes were due again in the fall, and he wasn't sure where the money would come from. Tom Bradley, his financial advisor, had been pushing him to consider his options. "The land's worth more than you think," Tom had said during their last uncomfortable meeting. "Development's coming to this part of the county whether we like it or not. That highway expansion project will bring traffic right past your front gate. Might be time to think about cashing out while the market's good." The idea made Eli's stomach turn. Selling would mean subdivisions and strip malls, soccer fields where cattle once grazed. His great-grandfather's homestead carved up into quarter-acre, lots with names like Boone's Ridge. Estates or Prairie Wind Commons. It would mean admitting that everything his family had built over 4 generations meant nothing more than a developer's profit margin, but keeping the ranch meant finding a way to make it profitable again. And Eli wasn't sure he had the energy for that kind of fight. Most days, he was lucky to get through his morning chores without feeling like the walls were closing in around him. The idea of starting over, of rebuilding what he'd let slip away, it seemed impossible, so he existed in a kind of limbo, maintaining the minimum to keep the place running, while avoiding any decisions that might force him to face the future. He fixed what broke, fed what needed feeding, and spent his evenings on the front porch with a beer and his own thoughts for company. The mountains turned purple in the sunset. The wind carried the scent of sage and grass. And somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang the same song his ancestors had heard when they first set foot on this land. It was a good life once. The kind of life men spent their whole careers in cities dreaming about. But without family to share it, without someone to pass it on to, it felt more like a beautiful prison. Eli knew he was slowly disappearing, becoming as empty and forgotten as the ghost towns that dotted the high plains. Another casualty of time and change and the terrible arithmetic of loss. He just hadn't expected salvation to come in the form of a dollar bid on a dog he'd never seen, at an auction he'd never wanted to attend. Saturday morning came with an insistent knock on Eli's front door that interrupted his second cup of coffee. Through the window, he could see Martha Henderson's pickup truck in his driveway, the bed loaded with boxes and household items. She was already dressed for town in her good blue dress and sensible shoes, her grey hair pinned up in the style she'd worn for 40 years. "Community auctions today," she announced when he opened the door, not waiting for an invitation to step inside. "I've got 3 boxes of Harold's old tools and some furniture I can't bear to look at anymore. You're driving me." It wasn't a request. Martha had perfected the art of making her suggestions sound like inevitable facts of nature. Eli started to protest, but she cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Don't you dare tell me you've got ranch work that can't wait. I've been watching you mope around this place for 5 years, and today you're going to be useful. Besides, there might be something there worth buying. You never know what treasures people decide to get rid of." An hour later, Eli found himself parking his truck in the dusty lot behind Murphy's Bar and Grill, where the monthly community auction had been held for as long as anyone could remember. The event served multiple purposes: clearing out unwanted items, raising money for the volunteer fire department, and providing the kind of social gathering that small towns needed to survive. Practically the entire population of Copper Creek would show up, even if they had no intention of buying anything. The auctioneer's platform had been set up in the shade of the building's east wall, with folding chairs arranged in rough semicircles around it. Tables groaned under the weight of donated items: kitchen appliances, farm tools, hunting gear, furniture, books, and the accumulated detritus of lives being simplified or settled. Eli helped Martha carry her boxes to the staging area, nodding to neighbors he hadn't spoken to in months. "Eli Boone," called out Buck Morrison, the fire chief and today's volunteer auctioneer. "Haven't seen you at one of these in quite a while." "Good to have you back." Buck was one of those perpetually cheerful men who seemed immune to life's disappointments. His son Jake had come back from Iraq with invisible wounds that showed in his eyes and the way he startled at sudden noises, but Buck maintained his optimistic outlook through sheer force of will. He clapped Eli on the shoulder with genuine warmth. "Jake's around here somewhere," Buck said. "Been meaning to bring him by your place. Might do you both some good to talk." You know how it is. Eli knew how it was. Jake Morrison had deployed 3 times to Iraq and Afghanistan, had seen things that no amount of talking would ever really fix. The young man was struggling to find his place in civilian life, just as Eli was struggling to find his place in a world without his son. They had grief in common, but Eli wasn't sure that was enough to build a friendship on. The auction began promptly at 10 o'clock, with Buck's booming voice calling the crowd to attention. The early items moved quickly: a set of snow tires, a barely used coffee maker, a collection of romance novels that brought catcalls and laughter from the crowd. Eli found himself relaxing slightly, caught up in the rhythm of the bidding and the familiar faces around him. For the first time in months, he felt almost normal. Then came the mystery lots, items donated anonymously or left behind when people moved away. Buck held up a battered suitcase filled with costume jewelry that sold for $12. A box of vinyl records went for $25. And then, carried to the platform by 2 teenage volunteers, came a wooden crate with air holes drilled in the sides and a burlap sack draped over the top. "Now here's an interesting donation," Buck announced, his voice losing some of its enthusiasm. "Looks like we've got ourselves a live animal in there. Can't see exactly what it is, but the note says it's been fed and watered and is ready for a new home." Someone in the crowd called out, "What kind of animal?" Buck lifted one corner of the burlap sack and peered inside. His expression shifted And when he spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. "Appears to be a puppy. Young one from the looks of it. Mixed breed, I'd guess." A murmur ran through the crowd, not entirely positive. People came to these auctions looking for bargains on useful items, not taking on the responsibility of caring for an animal. Eli could see heads shaking, people turning to each other with expressions that ranged from indifference to mild annoyance. "Who's going to start the bidding?" Buck asked. "How about $5? Silence. $5 for a puppy, Buck repeated, his auctioneer's training keeping his voice steady. "Come on now, somebody must need a farm dog." More silence. Eli could see the discomfort spreading through the crowd. People stared at their hands or found sudden interest in items on the far tables. The burlap sack over the crate moved slightly, and a small whimpering sound escaped from underneath. "How about $3? Buck tried again. $3 for a young dog? From somewhere in the crowd, a woman's voice called out, "What if it's sick? Who's going to pay the vet bills?" Another voice added, "Probably why somebody got rid of it in the first place." Buck's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his professional demeanor. $2 then. Surely someone can spare $2 for a creature that needs a home. The whimpering grew louder, and the sack shifted again. Eli found himself leaning forward in his chair, trying to see past the burlap to whatever was trapped underneath. The sound reminded him of Marcus as a baby, those soft cries that meant hunger or fear or the simple need for comfort. $1, Buck said, his voice finally showing strain. "I've got to start somewhere. $1 for this puppy, still no takers." The crowd had grown restless, people checking their watches and shifting in their chairs. They wanted to move on to items they might actually want, tools and furniture and useful things. A scared animal was just an inconvenience, a complication nobody needed. Eli's hand went unconsciously to his pocket, where he carried his grandfather's silver dollar. A good luck piece, the old man had called it, though luck had been in short supply lately. His grandfather had taught him that a man's character showed most clearly in how he treated the helpless, children, animals, people who couldn't fight back or speak for themselves. The whimpering continued, smaller and more desperate now. Whatever was under that sack was afraid and alone, abandoned by people who should have cared for it. Just like he felt most days, forgotten, unwanted, a burden that nobody knew how to handle. "Going once," Buck said reluctantly. $1 going once for this puppy. The crowd had already moved on mentally, conversations starting up about the next items to be auctioned. The volunteers were preparing to remove the crate, probably to dump it behind the building or take it to the animal shelter in the county seat, where unwanted animals went to die. "Going twice," Buck continued, his voice heavy with resignation. Eli's fingers closed around the silver dollar. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Sometimes, boy, the right thing to do is the only thing to do, whether folks understand it or not." He stood up slowly, his height making him visible over the crowd. $1, he called out, his voice rusty from disuse but carrying clearly across the lot. Buck's face broke into a smile of relief. "I've got $1 from Eli Boone. Do I hear two?" The crowd turned to look at him with expressions of surprise and something that might have been respect. But nobody raised the bid. Nobody wanted the responsibility of a frightened animal, even for such a small price. "Sold to Eli Boone for $1, Buck announced. "Come on up and collect your new friend, Eli." As he made his way through the crowd, Eli could hear whispered conversations following in his wake. Always was too soft-hearted for his own. Good. Hope he knows what he's getting himself into. Probably. Just going to put it down anyway. But when he reached the platform and carefully lifted the burlap sack, the whispers stopped. Inside the crate, pressed against the far corner, was the smallest, most pathetic creature he'd ever seen. A puppy, maybe 8 weeks old, with golden fur matted with dirt and eyes wide with terror. It shrank away from the light, trembling so hard its whole body shook. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Poor little thing." And suddenly Eli understood why nobody had bid. This wasn't a healthy farm dog ready to work. This was a broken animal that would need time, patience, and money to heal. Most people saw a burden, But Eli saw something else, a creature that understood abandonment and fear, that knew what it felt like to be overlooked and unwanted. He reached into his pocket and handed Buck the silver dollar, feeling the weight of his grandfather's memory in the exchange. Then he carefully picked up the crate, feeling the puppy's weight shift as it pressed itself against the far wall. "Thank you," Buck said quietly. "You're a good man, Eli Boone." Walking back to his truck with the crate in his arms, Eli caught Martha Henderson's eye. She was smiling at him with something that looked like pride, nodding her approval of his impulsive purchase. For the first time in years, he felt like he might have done something right. The puppy whimpered softly as he secured the crate in the truck bed, and Eli found himself speaking to it in the gentle tone he'd once used with Marcus when the boy was small and scared. "Easy now," he said. "You're safe. Nobody's gonna hurt you anymore." As he drove home with his unexpected passenger, Eli wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He didn't know the first thing about caring for a traumatized puppy, but as the truck bounced down the county road toward his ranch, he realized he was looking forward to finding out. The first night was a disaster. Eli had set up the crate in the kitchen, figuring the warmth from the old radiator would be comforting. But the puppy spent the entire night whimpering, scratching at the wire door, and relieving itself in terrified puddles. Every few hours, Eli would get up to check on the little creature, only to find it pressed against the back corner of the crate, shaking like a leaf in a thunderstorm. By morning, both man and dog were exhausted. The puppy wouldn't eat the kibble Eli had driven to town to buy, wouldn't drink water, and flinched away from any attempt at contact. It was clear that whatever trauma had led to its abandonment ran deeper than simple neglect. "You need professional help," Martha told him when she stopped by with a thermos of soup, and found Eli sitting at his kitchen table, staring helplessly at the huddled form in the crate. "Dr. Martinez over in Fairview is good with animals, especially the damaged ones. Dr. Rachel Martinez ran the only veterinary clinic within 50 miles, a small practice that served ranchers and pet owners across 3 counties. Eli had used her services before when his cattle needed attention, and he respected her no-nonsense approach to animal care. She was a woman in her 40s who'd grown up on a ranch herself and understood that rural veterinary work was as much about common sense as medical training. The drive to Fairview took 30 minutes, with the puppy crying pitifully in the passenger seat, despite Eli's attempts to speak soothingly. By the time they reached the clinic, his nerves were frayed, and his confidence in his impulsive auction purchase was evaporating fast. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Dr. Martinez said when she saw them in the examination room. She was a compact woman with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who'd handled thousands of frightened animals. "Martha called ahead and told me about your auction rescue. Let's see what we're dealing with." She examined the puppy with gentle efficiency, her hands moving carefully over its small frame while she murmured reassuring words in both English and Spanish. The little dog trembled but didn't try to bite, which she took as a good sign. "Male, probably about 10 weeks old," she reported as she worked. "Golden retriever mix? Maybe some lab in there. He's malnourished and dehydrated, but I don't see signs of serious abuse. More like neglect, probably taken from his mother too early and not properly cared for. The fear response suggests he hasn't had much positive human contact." She drew blood for tests and gave the puppy a thorough examination while Eli watched from across the room. There was something deeply comforting about watching a professional at work, someone who knew exactly what needed to be done and how to do it. "Good news is, he's basically healthy," Dr. Martinez said as she filled out paperwork. "Bad news is he's going to need patience and consistency to trust humans again. You up for that kind of project, Eli?" Eli looked at the puppy, now wrapped in a soft towel and looking slightly less terrified than when they'd arrived. "I think so. What do I need to know?" She handed him a folder thick with information sheets, vaccination schedules, and feeding guidelines. As she did, she paused and looked at him more carefully. "You know, I remember treating Marcus's dog when he was about 12. Sweet little beagle named Scout. You brought him in when he got into that fight with a porcupine, remember? The memory hit Eli like a physical blow. Scout had been Marcus's constant companion for 6 years, sleeping in the boy's bed and following him everywhere around the ranch. When the dog died of cancer during Marcus's senior year of high school, the boy had cried harder than Eli had ever seen. It was the first real loss Marcus had experienced, and in some ways it had prepared him for the harder losses that would come later. "I remember," Eli said quietly. "Scout was a good dog. The best kind of dog, loyal, smart, brave when he needed to be. Marcus loved that animal, something fierce." She studied Eli's face. "Maybe this little guy will be good medicine for both of you." The drive home was quieter, the puppy finally exhausted enough to sleep fitfully in the passenger seat. Eli found himself thinking about names as he navigated the county roads. The dog needed something strong, something that acknowledged both his rough start and his potential. When they pulled into the ranch driveway and the puppy lifted his head to look around with curious golden eyes, the name came to him suddenly. "Buckshot," he said aloud, testing how it sounded. The puppy's ears perked up slightly, as if he approved. "Yeah, I think that fits. You're small now, but you've got the look of a dog who'll grow into something substantial, establishing." A routine became Eli's new obsession. Dr. Martinez had emphasized the importance of consistency. Same feeding time, same sleeping place, same gentle approach every day until trust began to build. He moved Buckshot's crate to a corner of the living room where the dog could see him throughout the evening, and he began talking to the animal constantly, narrating his daily activities in the kind of steady, calm voice that might reassure a frightened child. "Time for breakfast, Buckshot. See, I'm putting your food right here where you can reach it. Good quality puppy food, just like the doc ordered. And fresh water in the blue bowl. That's your bowl now, nobody else's." Progress came in tiny increments. On the 3rd day, Buckshot ate half his breakfast while Eli sat quietly across the room. On the 5th day, the puppy ventured out of his crate to explore the living room, while Eli pretended to read his newspaper. By the end of the first week, Buckshot would take treats from Eli's hand, though he still flinched if the man moved too quickly. The folder from Dr. Martinez became a treasure trove of information that Eli studied like a textbook. Puppy development stages, training techniques, health warnings to watch for. He absorbed it all with the kind of focused attention he hadn't applied to anything in years. Tucked in the back of the folder, he discovered something that made his breath catch. Vaccination records for Scout, Marcus's old beagle. The yellowed papers were dated 15 years ago, covered with his own handwriting from when he'd been an active, involved father. First vaccinations, Scout doing well. Gaining weight, he'd written in the margin of one record. Marcus so proud of his dog. The simple notes brought back a flood of memories, teaching Marcus how to train Scout, watching boy and dog grow up together. The pride in his son's voice when he'd talk about his partner to anyone who would listen. It occurred to Eli that caring for Buckshot was the first thing he'd done in 5 years that connected him to those happier times, instead of pushing him further away from them. Marcus would have loved this little dog, would have had him trained and socialized within a month. The thought was painful but not devastating for once, a memory of his son that felt like a gift rather than a wound. The outside world intruded on their quiet routine during the 2nd week. When Martha brought news from the town council meeting that Eli had avoided attending, developers were there, she said over coffee at his kitchen table, watching Buckshot explore the boundaries of the living room. Fancy suits from Denver, talking about bringing prosperity to our little corner of nowhere. They've got big plans, according to Mayor Thompson. Eli felt his stomach tighten. He'd been dreading this conversation ever since Tom Bradley had mentioned development possibilities months ago.
What kind of plans?
Highway expansion, new commercial district, residential subdivisions. They're calling it strategic rural development, whatever that means. Sounds like they want to turn Copper Creek into a suburb. She paused to watch Buckshot sniff cautiously at his food bowl, tail wagging tentatively for the first time since Eli had brought him home. They're going to need land, Eli. A lot of land. and they're prepared to pay well for it. The implications hung in the air between them, like smoke from a grass fire. Eli's ranch sat right in the path of any major development coming from the east. If these developers were serious, the pressure to sell would become intense quickly. Did they mention any specific properties? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Martha nodded grimly. Your place was at the top of their list. Prime location, they called it. Gateway to the new Copper Creek. Buckshot chose that moment to approach Eli's chair, drawn by the scent of the bacon Martha had brought for breakfast. The puppy's tail wagged uncertainly as he sniffed at Eli's boots, the first truly voluntary interaction they'd shared. Eli carefully reached down and let Buckshot smell his hand before gently scratching behind the dog's ears. Well, Eli said quietly, I guess we'll deal with that when we have to. Right now, I've got more important things to worry about. But even as he spoke the words, he could feel the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a winter coat. The ranch that had been his sanctuary might soon become a battleground, and he wasn't sure he had the strength to fight for it. For now, though there was a small dog learning to trust again, and that seemed like the most important thing in the world. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning during the third week, when Eli was cleaning out the hall closet, a task he'd been avoiding for years. Buckshot had been following him around the house with increasing confidence, his natural curiosity finally overcoming his fear. As Eli pulled boxes from the closet's upper shelf, the puppy investigated each one with the thorough intensity that only young dogs possessed. One box tumbled open as it hit the floor, spilling its contents across the hardwood. Baseball cards, school photos, a leather mitt that still smelled faintly of neat's foot oil, and there, nestled among the treasures of boyhood, a small wooden whistle. Eli picked it up with trembling fingers, remembering the afternoon Marcus had carved it in woodshop class. Aged 10 and proud as could be of his first real craftsmanship project. Look, Dad, Marcus had said, demonstrating the whistle's clear, sharp note. Mr. Henderson says I've got real potential with woodworking. Maybe I could build cabinets or something when I grow up. Eli had encouraged the interest, setting up a workbench in the barn where Marcus could practice his carving and learn the satisfaction of creating something with his hands. The whistle had been the beginning of that journey, leading to birdhouses and small furniture, pieces, and eventually the beautiful jewelry box Marcus had made for his mother's birthday the year before he enlisted. Now, Buckshot was sniffing at the whistle with intense interest, his tail wagging for the first time since Eli had brought him home. Acting on instinct, Eli put the whistle to his lips and blew a soft, testing note. The sound was clear and sweet, exactly as he remembered. Buckshot's reaction was immediate and startling. The puppy dropped into a playbow, rear end high in the air, tail wagging furiously. He barked once, a sharp, happy sound that was nothing like the frightened whimpering Eli had grown accustomed to. Then he bounded forward and began running circles around Eli's legs, as if the whistle had awakened something joyful in his canine soul. Well, I'll be damned, Eli said softly, blowing the whistle again. Buckshot responded with another playbow and more enthusiastic circling. For the first time, he looked like what he was supposed to be, a young dog ready to engage with the world instead of hiding from it. That afternoon, while Buckshot napped in a patch of sunlight on the living room floor, Martha arrived with her usual offering of food and neighborhood gossip. This time she brought a tuna casserole and Jake Morrison, Buck's son, who'd been home from his last deployment for 8 months and still looked like a man trying to find his footing on unsteady ground. Jake was 32, but carried himself like someone much older, his shoulders slightly hunched and his eyes constantly scanning for threats that probably weren't there. He'd lost weight since Eli had last seen him, and there was a nervous energy about him that spoke of too little sleep and too much caffeine. But when he saw Buckshot, something in his expression softened. Good-looking dog, Jake said, crouching down to let Buckshot sniff his hand. Rescue? Auction rescue, Eli replied, watching as Buckshot cautiously approached the newcomer. Somebody dumped him, and he's been working on trusting people again. Jake's smile was knowing. Yeah, I get that. Trust's a hard thing to rebuild once it's been broken. There was weight in those words that had nothing to do with dogs, and Eli found himself studying the younger man more carefully. Jake had deployed to Afghanistan twice and Iraq once, serving as a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne. He'd come home with commendations and invisible wounds that his family didn't quite know how to handle. Been thinking about getting a dog myself, Jake continued, now sitting cross-legged on the floor while Buckshot worked up the courage to approach closer. Something to keep me company. The quiet gets to me sometimes, you know, Eli knew. The silence of the ranch could be either blessing or curse, depending on where your mind wandered when there was nothing to distract it. For Jake, the quiet probably carried echoes of places where silence meant danger, where a moment's inattention could mean the difference between life and death. You're welcome to come by and visit this one, Eli offered. Might do you both some good. I'm still figuring out the training part, and so began an unlikely friendship. Jake started coming by 3 or 4 afternoons a week, usually arriving around the time Eli finished his daily chores. He had a natural way with Buckshot, patient and consistent in a way that spoke of military discipline applied to gentler purposes. Under Jake's guidance, the puppy began learning basic commands: sit, stay, come, and more importantly, he began to understand that humans could be sources of good things like treats and play and affection. You've got to make yourself the most interesting thing in his world, Jake explained as they worked with Buckshot in the front yard. Dogs want to please, but they need to understand what you're asking and why it's worth their while. The irony wasn't lost on Eli that a man who struggled to find his own place in the world was helping a damaged dog discover his. But Jake seemed more relaxed on the ranch than anywhere else, his nervous energy settling into focused purpose when he was working with Buckshot. It was during one of these training sessions that Buckshot showed his first signs of protective instinct. The delivery truck had turned into the driveway, its diesel engine loud and unfamiliar. The puppy immediately positioned himself between Eli and the approaching vehicle, his small body tense and alert. He didn't bark or show aggression, but his intent was clear. He was prepared to defend his person if necessary. That's good instinct, Jake observed. He's bonding with you, claiming you as his pack. Give it a few more months, and you'll have yourself a real ranch dog. The delivery was from Tom Bradley's office, another packet of financial documents and development proposals that Eli had been avoiding. Tom had been calling regularly, leaving increasingly urgent messages about the need to explore options before market conditions changed. The pressure was building like a summer thunderstorm, impossible to ignore much longer. That evening, after Jake had gone home and Buckshot was settled in his crate for the night, Eli spread the documents across his kitchen table and forced himself to confront the numbers. The developers were offering nearly twice what the ranch had been worth 5 years ago. It was enough money to pay off all debts, buy a smaller place somewhere else, and live comfortably for the rest of his life. It was also enough to make him sick to his stomach. The proposals came with glossy renderings of what Copper Creek could become. Heritage Village, a planned community that would preserve the authentic Western character while providing modern amenities. The images showed neat rows of houses with fake rustic siding, a shopping center designed to look like an Old West Main Street, and recreational areas where his pastures currently stretched toward the mountains. Buckshot whimpered softly in his sleep, perhaps dreaming of the frightening experiences that had shaped his early life. Eli looked at the puppy and thought about second chances, about the way trust could be rebuilt with patience and consistency. But trust, once broken, was never quite the same as trust that had never been tested. There were always scars, always vulnerabilities that had to be carefully managed. The same was true of homes and communities. Once you let the developers in, once you accepted their vision of progress over preservation, there was no going back. Copper Creek would become something else entirely. And the life Eli had known, the life his family had known for 4 generations, would exist only in memory. He gathered up the papers and stuffed them back in their envelope. Decision postponed for another day. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods that his great-grandfather had planted as windbreaks, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. These were the sounds of his childhood, the backdrop to every important moment of his life. The idea of replacing them with traffic noise and leaf blowers and the constant hum of suburban activity felt like a betrayal of everything he'd inherited. But keeping the ranch meant finding a way to make it financially viable, and right now Eli wasn't sure how to do that. The cattle operation barely broke even, and he was too old and too tired to start over with something new. Maybe the smart thing would be to take the money and run, to cash out while the getting was good and let someone else fight the battles of rural survival. Buckshot stirred in his crate and opened his eyes, looking directly at Eli with the kind of trust that had taken weeks to build. The puppy had learned to believe that this place was safe, that the man who fed him and protected him could be counted on. It was a lesson that had required patience and consistency and faith in the possibility of better days ahead. Maybe that was the lesson Eli needed to learn as well. Maybe fighting for what mattered wasn't about guaranteeing victory. It was about refusing to give up, even when the odds seemed impossible. Especially then. The silver Honda Civic appeared in Eli's driveway on a Thursday afternoon, like a ghost from his past, stirring up dust and memories in equal measure. He recognized the car before he saw the driver, felt his chest tighten with emotions he'd worked 5 years to bury. Sarah had always been punctual about maintenance, always kept her vehicles clean and running smoothly. Some things apparently hadn't changed. She stepped out of the car, wearing a blue dress he remembered buying for her 20th wedding anniversary, her graying hair shorter than it used to be, but still catching the light the same way. At 58, she remained a handsome woman, though the lines around her eyes spoke of sorrows shared and battles fought alone. For a moment they stood 20 yards apart, looking at each other across a chasm 5 years wide. Buckshot broke the tension by bounding off the porch to investigate this new arrival, his tail wagging with the confident curiosity he'd developed over the past month. Sarah's face softened when she saw him, and she knelt down to let him sniff her outstretched hand. "Well, hello there. Beautiful," she said, in the gentle voice Eli remembered her using with Marcus's childhood pets. "Aren't you a handsome fellow?" Buckshot responded to her tone by offering his belly for scratching, a sign of trust that still surprised Eli when it happened. Sarah laughed, a sound that cut through his defenses like a blade through tissue paper, and obliged the puppy with gentle attention. "He's new," she said without looking up, her voice carefully neutral. "Month ago. Auction rescue." Eli's own voice sounded rusty, formal. "His name's Buckshot. He's beautiful." "Golden retriever? Mix of some kind. Doc Martinez thinks maybe some lab." The conversation felt stilted, artificial, like actors reading lines they hadn't properly rehearsed. Sarah stood up and dusted off her hands, finally meeting his eyes directly. "I came to talk. Eli, if you're willing." He wanted to say no, wanted to protect the fragile piece he'd built around himself like armor. But Buckshot was looking back and forth between them with the intuitive understanding that dogs seemed to possess about human emotions. And somehow the puppy's presence made the moment feel less dangerous. "Coffee's fresh," he said finally. "Come on in." The kitchen felt smaller with Sarah in it, as if her presence had rearranged the familiar geometry of the space. She sat at the table where she'd eaten thousands of meals, where she'd helped Marcus with homework, where they'd planned their life together, back when the future seemed knowable and manageable. Buckshot settled between their chairs, a furry mediator who seemed to sense the tension. "You look good," Sarah said after accepting a mug of coffee. "Tired, but good. Better than the last time I saw you." The last time had been at the lawyer's office, signing divorce papers with numb efficiency while their 25-year marriage dissolved into asset distribution and custody arrangements for a son who was already dead. Not exactly a memory either of them wanted to revisit. "Buckshot's been good company," Eli said, reaching down to scratch the puppy's ears. "Gives me something to focus on besides myself." Sarah watched the interaction with an expression he couldn't quite read. I heard about him from Martha. She called me last week, said you seemed different, more engaged. Martha's been keeping tabs on me, has she? She's worried about you. We all are. Sarah paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. I'm worried about you. The admission hung between them like morning mist, fragile and temporary. Eli felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of muscles he hadn't realized were clenched. I'm getting by, he said. Taking it one day at a time. Are you? Because from where I sit, it looks like you've been hiding from life for 5 years. Like you've been punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. The words hit harder than they should have, perhaps because they contained more truth than he was ready to face. Eli felt his defenses rising, but Buckshot chose that moment to rest his head on his knee, offering the kind of wordless comfort that made anger harder to sustain. Marcus made his own choices, Sarah continued, her voice steadier now. He chose to enlist, chose to serve his country, chose to be the kind of man who would run toward danger instead of away from it. Those were his choices, Eli, not yours. I could have stopped him. No, you couldn't have. He was 21 years old and determined to serve. If you'd tried to stop him, he would have resented you for it. She leaned forward slightly. He wrote to me, you know, every week while he was deployed. And in every letter, he talked about you. About the ranch, about coming home to work alongside his dad, about the values you'd taught him. Eli's throat felt tight. He stopped writing to me after the first month. No, he didn't. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope, thick with papers. Eli recognized his own handwriting on the address label, but the envelope had never been opened. These came back to the house after the funeral, Sarah said quietly. Return to sender. I should have given them to you years ago, but I was so angry, so hurt. I thought if you'd written to him more, called more, maybe he would have... Her voice broke slightly. I blamed you for not being there enough. And I blamed myself for the same thing. The envelope contained a dozen letters, all addressed to Specialist Marcus Boone at his forward operating base in Afghanistan, all returned unopened due to his death. The postmark showed Eli had written weekly for the entire 6 months of Marcus's deployment, pouring his heart out onto paper in ways he'd never been able to do in person. I wrote every week, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I told him about the ranch, about the cattle, about how proud I was of him. I told him I loved him. He knew that, Eli. In his letters home, he talked about how hard it was that you two had never been good at talking about feelings. But he knew you loved him. He never doubted that. Buckshot seemed to sense the emotional weight of the moment and moved closer to Eli, pressing his warm body against the man's leg. The contact was grounding, a reminder that life continued even in the midst of overwhelming grief. I keep thinking I should have done something different, Eli said. Should have been a better father, should have found a way to keep him home, should have, could have, would have. Sarah interrupted gently. I've been down that road, Eli. It leads nowhere good. We did our best with what we knew at the time. We raised a good man who chose to serve his country with honor. We can't control the outcome, but we can honor the choice. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 5 years of separation and grief settling between them like dust after a storm. Finally, Sarah reached across the table and touched his hand. The first physical contact they'd shared since the divorce. I'm sorry I left, she said. I couldn't watch you disappear into your grief, but running away didn't help either of us heal. I'm sorry I let you go. I wasn't much company for anyone back then. Outside, a truck rumbled down the county road, breaking the spell of their conversation. Sarah withdrew her hand and sat back in her chair, but something fundamental had shifted between them. There's something else we need to talk about, she said, her tone becoming more businesslike. The development proposals. Tom Bradley called me last week about the financial implications. He's concerned about your long-term viability here. The real world came flooding back like cold water. You heard about the town meeting tomorrow night? Martha told me. She also told me you're planning to attend. Eli nodded. The thought of speaking publicly made his stomach clench. But he couldn't let other people make decisions about his community's future without at least voicing his opinion. "I can't just sit by and watch them turn this place into a suburb," he said. "This land has been in my family for 4 generations. Marcus loved this place. He planned to come back here, to raise his own children here." Sarah's expression softened. "I know he did. But Eli, you have to be practical. The money they're offering, it could set you up for life. You could buy a smaller place, somewhere easier to manage. And do what? Sit around and wait to die?" The question came out harsher than he'd intended, but it reflected the fear that had been growing in him for weeks. Selling the ranch wouldn't just mean losing the land. It would mean admitting that the life he'd built, the legacy he'd planned to leave, had been meaningless. Buckshot whined softly and pushed his nose against Eli's hand, demanding attention. The simple gesture reminded him that even in the midst of impossible decisions, there were still creatures depending on him, still reasons to keep fighting. "I have to try," he said finally. "I have to try to save what we built here. For Marcus, for my grandfather, for the community. Maybe I'll fail, but at least I'll know I tried." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then I guess we'd better figure out how to make the strongest possible case. Because if you're going to fight, you might as well fight to win." For the first time in 5 years, Eli felt like he might not be facing the future alone. The morning after Sarah's visit, Eli found Jake sitting on his front porch steps at dawn, staring out at the pasture with the 1,000-yard stare that combat veterans knew too well. Buckshot was curled up beside him, providing the kind of wordless comfort that dogs seemed designed to offer. "Rough night?" Eli asked, settling down on the steps beside them with 2 cups of coffee. Jake accepted the coffee gratefully, his hands wrapped around the mug like it might anchor him to the present moment. "Dreams again. Same damn patrol, same IED, same faces I couldn't save." He glanced at Eli sideways. "Sorry for showing up so early. Your dog here seemed to think I needed company." Buckshot's got good instincts about people. Eli scratched behind the puppy's ears, noting how the dog positioned himself to maintain contact with both men. "Dreams like that, do they ever get easier?" "Some days are better than others. Doc says it's normal, part of processing trauma. But knowing it's normal doesn't make it feel any less real when you're in the middle of it." Jake sipped his coffee, his breathing slowly becoming more regular. "How do you handle it?" "The grief, I mean. Losing Marcus." It was the first time Jake had asked directly about Eli's loss, though the question had been hanging between them for weeks. Eli considered his answer carefully, watching the sun rise over the eastern pasture where he'd taught Marcus to ride when the boy was barely old enough to stay in the saddle. "Most days I don't handle it very well," he admitted. "But having something to focus on helps. Something that needs me, like Buckshot here. Gives me a reason to get up in the morning." "Yeah, I can see that. He's gotten pretty attached to you, and you to him." It was true. Over the past month, Buckshot had become more than just a pet. He'd become a partner, a constant presence that made the ranch feel less empty. The puppy followed Eli everywhere during his daily chores, learning the rhythms of ranch life with the quick intelligence that working dogs possessed. "I've been thinking about expanding his training," Eli said. "Teach him some real ranch work, herding, protection, that kind of thing. You interested in helping? Might be good therapy for both of us." Jake's smile was the first genuine one Eli had seen from him in weeks. "I'd like that. Been missing having a mission, you know. Something with clear objectives and measurable results." They began working with Buckshot that very morning, starting with basic obedience and gradually introducing more complex tasks. Jake had a natural understanding of the dog's intelligence and motivations, breaking down each lesson into manageable steps that built on previous success. His military experience with working dogs during deployment proved invaluable, and Buckshot responded to his calm, consistent leadership with enthusiasm. "The key is making him want to succeed," Jake explained as they worked on teaching Buckshot to move cattle from one pasture to another. "Dogs are pack animals. They want to contribute to the group effort. You just have to help them understand what their job is." Within 2 weeks, Buckshot was showing remarkable progress. He could move Eli's small herd of cattle with growing confidence, responding to whistles and hand signals with the precision of a dog bred for the work. More importantly, he was developing the protective instincts that ranch dogs needed, alerting Eli to intruders and unusual activity with measured authority rather than nervous barking. The training sessions became a regular routine that gave both men purpose and distraction from their respective struggles. Jake seemed more grounded when he was working with the dog, his nervous energy channeled into productive focus. And Eli found himself looking forward to their sessions with an anticipation he hadn't felt about anything in years. Sarah began joining them for dinner twice a week, an arrangement that evolved naturally from her initial visit. She'd moved back to Grand Junction permanently, but the 40-minute drive to the ranch had become a regular part of her routine. Her presence changed the dynamic in subtle but important ways, softening some of Jake's rough edges and reminding Eli of the social graces he'd let atrophy during his years of isolation. "You know," she said one evening as they watched Jake work with Buckshot in the front yard, "I haven't seen you this engaged with life since before Marcus deployed. Whatever this is, the dog, Jake's friendship, fighting for the ranch, it's good for you." The community organizing against the development had intensified since the town meeting, where Eli had surprised himself by speaking passionately about the value of preserving rural communities. His words had been clumsy at first, rusty from disuse, but his conviction had carried them forward. He talked about land stewardship, about the responsibility each generation had to the next, about the difference between growth and progress. The developers, however, weren't giving up easily. Property owners throughout the area reported visits from well-dressed representatives offering increasingly attractive deals. Some neighbors were wavering, tempted by offers that represented more money than they'd ever imagined their land could be worth. The pressure was building like steam in a kettle. It was during one of these tense weeks that Buckshot proved his worth in ways none of them had anticipated. The Hendersons' 5-year-old granddaughter had come to visit for the weekend, an energetic little girl named Emma, who loved exploring the wide-open spaces that her city life didn't provide. On Saturday afternoon, while Martha was hanging laundry and assumed Emma was playing safely in the front yard, the child wandered off toward the creek that ran between the two properties. Buckshot was the first to notice something was wrong. He'd been dozing on Eli's porch when he suddenly lifted his head, ears alert, body tense with the focused attention that Jake had trained into him. A moment later, he was running toward the property line, barking with an urgency that brought Eli to his feet. By the time Eli reached the creek, he could see Emma 20 yards downstream, struggling in water that was deeper than she was tall. The spring runoff had turned the normally gentle creek into a swift-moving current that was rapidly carrying the child toward a culvert where she could easily be trapped or drowned. Buckshot didn't hesitate. The 6-month-old puppy plunged into the water and swam powerfully toward Emma, his golden coat bright against the dark water. He reached her just as her head went under for the second time, grabbing her jacket in his teeth and pulling her toward the shallower water near the bank where Eli could reach them both. The rescue took less than 5 minutes, but the impact lasted much longer. Emma was frightened but unharmed, and Martha was so grateful she couldn't stop crying. Word of Buckshot's heroism spread through the community like wildfire, adding another layer to the growing bond between Eli and his dog. "That's not normal puppy behavior," Jake observed later, as they toweled Buckshot dry in Eli's kitchen. "That kind of protective instinct, that level of commitment, that's special. He really has adopted you as his pack." Eli looked at the exhausted puppy, who was finally sleeping peacefully in his favorite spot by the radiator, and felt something shift in his chest. For 5 years, he'd been afraid to care about anything deeply, terrified of experiencing another devastating loss. But watching Buckshot risk his own life to save a child had reminded him that love, real love, required courage. It meant accepting the possibility of loss in exchange for the certainty of connection. That night, while organizing Marcus's things in preparation for Sarah's next visit, Eli discovered something that stopped him cold. Tucked inside an old duffel bag were Marcus's combat boots, still bearing traces of Afghan dust, and beneath them a small journal he'd never seen before. The journal contained Marcus's private thoughts during his deployment, written in the careful handwriting Eli remembered from school reports and letters home. Most entries were mundane. Descriptions of daily life on base, complaints about the food, observations about his fellow soldiers. But scattered throughout were reflections on home, on family, on the lessons his father had taught him. Dad always said that a man's character shows in how he treats animals and people who can't defend themselves. Marcus had written after a particularly difficult day. Saw that prove true today when Jenkins kicked a stray dog that was just looking for food. Dad would have knocked him flat. Sometimes I think I joined the army to prove I'm half the man he is. Another entry, dated just 2 weeks before his death. Got Dad's letter today, even though he doesn't know I'm getting them. Mail clerk has been saving them for me. Something about forwarding addresses getting messed up. He writes about the ranch like it's the most important place on earth. Maybe it is. Can't wait to get home and work alongside him again. Want to show him I learned something about leadership over here? About what it means to take care of people. Eli sat on his bedroom floor with the journal in his lap, tears streaming down his face as he realized Marcus had been planning a future that included both of them. The boy had died, believing his father's letters weren't reaching him, never knowing how much Eli had missed him, how proud he'd been, how desperately he'd wanted his son to come home safe. But Marcus had carried his father's lessons with him anyway, had used them to become the kind of soldier and man who would risk his own life for others. In that sense, at least, Eli hadn't failed completely. He carried the combat boots downstairs and placed them by the front door, where Jake would see them in the morning. Some gifts were too important to keep to yourself, and some legacies were worth sharing with people who could understand their value. It was Buckshot who found the first clue, as dogs often do when their human companions are too distracted to notice what's hidden in plain sight. The discovery happened on a Tuesday morning in early May, when spring wildflowers were painting the pastures, in shades of purple and gold that reminded Eli why his great-grandfather had chosen this particular piece of earth to call home. Buckshot had been exploring the far corner of the north pasture, following some scent trail that only he could detect. When he began digging frantically at the base of an old fence post, his behavior was different from his usual curiosity, more focused, more urgent, as if he'd found something that demanded immediate attention. "What you got there, boy?" Eli called out, approaching with the lazy interest of a man who assumed his dog had discovered another prairie dog burrow, or perhaps the remains of some long-dead animal. But when he reached the spot where Buckshot was digging, Eli's casual interest sharpened into something closer to alarm. The dog had uncovered the corner of what appeared to be a metal case, buried just deep enough to be hidden from casual observation, but shallow enough to suggest it hadn't been there very long. Jake arrived as Eli was working to free the case from the hard-packed earth, drawn by the unusual intensity of Buckshot's barking. Between the two of them, they managed to extract a waterproof surveyor's case, the kind used by professional land assessment teams to protect sensitive equipment and documents. "This doesn't belong here," Eli said, turning the case over in his hands. The latches were secured with small padlocks, but years of ranch work had taught him creative solutions to such problems. A few minutes with a tire iron from his truck, and the case opened with a soft pop of equalized pressure. Inside, nestled in custom foam padding, were instruments that Eli recognized as surveying equipment, a laser rangefinder, GPS units, soil testing probes, and something that looked like a handheld device for measuring electromagnetic fields. But it was the documents that made his breath catch in his throat. Maps, detailed topographic maps of his ranch and the surrounding area, marked with symbols and notations that meant nothing to him, but clearly meant something significant to whoever had created them. Grid references, elevation markers, and what appeared to be mineral composition data covered every sheet in meticulous detail. "Jake," Eli said quietly, his voice tight with growing concern. "You need to look at this." Jake examined the maps with the analytical eye of someone trained to extract intelligence from confusing information. His face grew increasingly grim as he studied the notations and cross-referenced them with the surveying instruments. "This is a comprehensive geological survey," he said finally. "Professional-grade, expensive equipment. Someone's been mapping your land down to the mineral level, measuring electromagnetic signatures, testing soil composition. This isn't development planning, this is resource extraction assessment. The implications hit Eli like a physical blow. Are you saying there's something valuable under my land?" "I'm saying someone thinks there is, and they've gone to considerable expense to find out for sure." Jake held up a GPS unit that was still recording coordinates. "This equipment has been used recently. Within the last few weeks, I'd guess." A cold dread was settling in Eli's stomach, but he forced himself to think clearly. "Why bury it on my property? Why not take it with them when they finished? Maybe they're planning to come back. Maybe they're waiting for something." Jake paused, studying Eli's face. "Or maybe they got interrupted and had to leave in a hurry." That evening, while Sarah helped them research the technical specifications of the surveying equipment online, Eli called Tom Bradley at home. His financial advisor sounded nervous from the moment he heard Eli's voice, especially when Eli described what they'd found. "I don't know anything about any geological surveys," Tom said, but his tone lacked conviction. "The developers I've been dealing with are focused on residential and commercial development, not mining or resource extraction." "Tom," Eli said quietly, "I've known you for 15 years. You're lying to me. What aren't you telling me?" A long silence stretched across the phone line before Tom finally spoke again. "There were some preliminary assessments done in the area, routine due diligence for any major development project. But I wasn't told about any specific findings." "Preliminary assessments by whom?" "The Development Consortium. Mountain West Holdings, I think they're called. They hired a geological consulting firm to evaluate the area's potential for various types of development." "And you didn't think to mention this to me?" "Eli, I was trying to protect your interests. If word got out about potential mineral resources, it could complicate the sale process, drive up speculation, bring in outside investors who might not be willing to pay fair market value for the surface rights." The conversation ended badly, with Tom promising to make inquiries and Eli promising to consider his legal options. But as he hung up the phone, a new piece of the puzzle was forming in his mind. The developers' aggressive offers, the pressure to sell quickly, the reluctance to negotiate, it all made sense. If they knew something about his land that he didn't. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor who provided the final piece of the puzzle. Dr. Martinez arrived unannounced, her veterinary truck pulling into the driveway just as Eli was finishing his morning chores. But this wasn't a professional call. Her expression was troubled, almost guilty. "I need to tell you something about Buckshot," she said without preamble. "Something I should have mentioned when you first brought him in." Eli felt his stomach clench. "Is he sick? Did you find something in his tests?" "No, nothing like that. He's perfectly healthy." She paused, reaching down to pet Buckshot, who had bounded over to greet her with his usual enthusiasm. "It's about where he came from. I know who owned him before the auction." The story that emerged was both simpler and more complex than Eli had imagined. Buckshot had belonged to Amanda Chen, a young geological engineer who'd been hired by Mountain West Holdings to conduct surveys in the Copper Creek area. She'd brought the puppy with her from Denver, a companion for what she'd expected to be several weeks of field work in a remote area. She loved that dog, Dr. Martinez said. Brought him in for his puppy vaccinations, talked about how smart he was, how quickly he was learning. But then something changed. She came in one day about 6 weeks ago, crying, saying she had to get rid of him. Said her boss had ordered her to dispose of the dog because it was compromising the operation. Dispose of how? That's what I asked. She said they wanted her to have him put down, claimed he was interfering with their work somehow. She refused, said she'd rather find him a new home. I suggested the community auction as a way to ensure he'd go to someone local who would care for him. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Amanda Chen had been conducting geological surveys on Eli's land, probably without permission, and Buckshot had somehow become a liability. Perhaps the puppy had interfered with equipment, or maybe his presence had made their covert operations too visible. Either way, the developers had seen a living creature as nothing more than a problem to be eliminated. Where is she now? Eli asked. This Amanda Chen? Gone. Left town suddenly about a month ago. But before she left, she gave me this. Dr. Martinez reached into her truck and pulled out a manila envelope. Said if anyone ever came asking about the surveys she was doing, I should give them this. She seemed scared, Eli, really scared. Inside the envelope was a flash drive and a handwritten note. I'm sorry for what we did to your land. I tried to stop them, but they threatened my career, my family. The data on this drive will show you what they found. Use it to protect yourself. AC. That evening, with Jake's help with the technical aspects and Sarah's assistance with the legal implications, they loaded the data from the flash drive onto Eli's computer. What they found exceeded their worst fears and greatest hopes in equal measure. The geological surveys revealed significant deposits of rare earth minerals beneath Eli's ranch, elements crucial for electronics manufacturing, renewable energy systems, and advanced military applications. The estimated value of the mineral rights alone exceeded $20 million, more than 10 times what the developers had been offering for the surface rights. They've been planning to buy your land cheap, then mine it for the minerals, Jake said, his voice tight with anger. The residential development was just a cover story to explain their interest in the property. Can they do that legally? Zara asked. If Eli doesn't own the mineral rights separately, yes. In Colorado, surface rights and mineral rights can be owned separately. But according to these surveys, his family has owned both since the original homestead. Jake pulled up another document from the flash drive. The problem is, they're planning to challenge his mineral rights ownership in court after they acquire the surface rights. Claim some technicality in the original land grants. Eli stared at the computer screen, watching his world reorganize itself around this new information. The pressure to sell, Tom Bradley's evasiveness, the community auction where Buckshot had been abandoned. It was all part of a deliberate strategy to acquire valuable resources while keeping the true owners in the dark. So what do we do? He asked. Sarah and Jake exchanged a look that spoke of shared determination. We fight, Sarah said simply. We expose what they're doing and we fight. It won't be easy, Jake warned. They have money, lawyers, political connections, and they've already got some of your neighbors ready to sell. Eli looked out the window at the land his great-grandfather had homesteaded, the pastures where Marcus had learned to ride, the home that 4 generations of his family had built with their own hands. Then he looked down at Buckshot, who was sleeping peacefully at his feet, the dog who had led them to the truth through his simple act of digging in the dirt. Then we'd better get started, he said, because I'm not giving up without a fight. For the first time in 5 years, Eli Boone had something worth fighting for. And for the first time in his life, he had allies willing to fight beside him. The transformation began with Marcus's field journal, the one Eli had discovered weeks earlier among his son's personal effects. What had started as a father's desperate attempt to feel closer to his lost child became something far more. Practical and immediate, a tactical manual for the battle. Ahead, Marcus had possessed a strategic mind that combined his father's practical wisdom with formal military training. His field notes revealed a young man who thought systematically about problems, who understood that winning required more than good intentions and righteous anger. As Eli studied the journal by lamplight in his kitchen, with Buckshot sleeping at his feet and the sounds of the rural night pressing against the windows, he began to see patterns that could be applied to civilian conflicts. Intelligence gathering is the foundation of any successful operation, Marcus had written after a particularly challenging patrol. You have to understand your enemy's capabilities, motivations, and vulnerabilities before you can develop an effective strategy. Assumptions get people killed. The word stung because they highlighted how naive Eli had been about the developers' true intentions. He'd assumed they were simply businessmen looking to build houses and shopping centers, not corporate raiders conducting covert geological surveys and planning to strip mine his family's land. That assumption had nearly cost him everything. Jake found him at the kitchen table the next morning, surrounded by legal documents, survey maps, and pages of handwritten notes. Sarah's car was already in the driveway. She'd driven over from Grand Junction before dawn to help coordinate their response. "Looks like you've been up all night," Jake observed, accepting a cup of coffee from Sarah. "Find anything useful in Marcus's writings?" "A roadmap," Eli said simply. "He understood something I'm just learning, that fighting smart is more important than fighting hard. We need to think like they think, anticipate their moves, force them to react to us, instead of the other way around." Over the following weeks, their kitchen table became a command center that would have made any military intelligence unit proud. Sarah used her background in hospital administration to create organizational charts and communication trees that would allow them to coordinate community resistance effectively. Jake contributed his knowledge of information warfare and logistics, helping them understand how to gather evidence, document wrongdoing, and present their case in ways that would resonate with both legal authorities and public opinion. But it was Eli who provided the driving vision, drawing on Marcus's tactical insights to develop a comprehensive strategy for exposing and defeating the developer's scheme. His son's journal had taught him that successful operations required multiple contingency plans, clear objectives, and the ability to adapt quickly when circumstances changed. "We're fighting on several fronts simultaneously," Eli explained to the growing group of neighbors and community members who had begun attending their evening planning sessions. "Legal action to protect our mineral rights, media pressure to expose their deceptive practices, and political advocacy to ensure local officials understand the true scope of what's at stake." Martha Henderson had become their unofficial communications coordinator, using her network of long-time residents to spread information and organize resistance. Doc Martinez provided meeting space at her clinic when the group grew too large for Eli's kitchen. Even Buck Morrison, despite his natural tendency toward optimism and compromise, had joined their cause after learning about the geological surveys conducted without landowner consent. The developers, meanwhile, were escalating their own tactics. Property owners reported increasingly aggressive visits from representatives offering ever larger sums of money, always with artificial deadlines and pressure to sign immediately. Some neighbors received legal notices questioning their property boundaries or mineral rights ownership. Others faced sudden problems with permits for routine maintenance or small construction projects. "They're trying to create a sense of crisis," Jake explained during one of their evening strategy sessions. "Make people feel like they're under siege, that selling out is the only way to escape the pressure." It's psychological warfare, basically. The harassment campaign reached Eli's ranch on a Thursday afternoon when two men in expensive suits appeared at his front door, accompanied by a sheriff's deputy with an uncomfortable expression. They claimed to represent a consortium of investors and demanded access to his property for a routine boundary survey that they insisted was required by law. Buckshot's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The normally friendly dog positioned himself between Eli and the visitors, his body tense and alert, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He'd never shown aggression towards strangers before, but something about these particular men triggered every protective instinct he possessed. "I'll need to see a court order," Eli said calmly, his hand resting on Buckshot's head. "And I'll want my attorney present for any surveys conducted on my property." The lead representative, a thin man with cold eyes and an expensive watch, smiled without warmth. Mr. Boone, we're trying to handle this professionally, but there are legal mechanisms that can compel your cooperation if you choose to be difficult. Then I guess we'll see each other in court, Eli replied, gently restraining Buckshot as the dog's growling intensified. Have a good day, gentlemen. After they left, Jake examined the legal documents they'd presented and shook his head grimly. These are intimidation tactics, pure and simple. The paperwork doesn't actually give them any authority to access your property, but most people wouldn't know that. They're counting on fear and ignorance to get what they want. The incident crystallized something that had been building in Eli for weeks. The broken-down widower who had bought a frightened puppy for $1 was gone, replaced by a man who understood that some fights were too important to lose. Marcus's journal had taught him that leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about making decisions, under pressure and inspiring others to believe that victory was possible. We need to accelerate our timeline, he announced at that evening's planning meeting. They're getting desperate, which means they're dangerous. But it also means we're having an impact. Sarah had been researching legal precedents for mineral rights disputes, building a case that would protect not just Eli's property, but establish principles that could help other community members. Her work was methodical and thorough, reflecting the same attention to detail that had made her successful in hospital administration. I'm taking a leave of absence from work, she announced, her voice steady and determined. This is too important, and you're going to need someone here full-time to coordinate the legal response. Eli felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had been absent for so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Sarah, you don't have to— Yes, I do, she interrupted gently. This is our home, Eli, our community. Marcus loved this place, and I won't let some corporate raiders destroy it for profit. Jake had been working his own networks, reaching out to other veterans who might be willing to help. His military contacts included lawyers, investigators, and media specialists who understood the importance of exposing corruption and protecting rural communities from exploitation. I've got 3 guys coming in this weekend, he reported. Tom Rodriguez was a JAG officer who specializes in land rights cases. Billy Chen, no relation to the geologist, different family, is a private investigator who knows how to dig up information that corporations prefer to keep buried. And Mike Thompson is a journalist who's been covering corporate malfeasance for the Denver Post. The network of support was growing beyond anything Eli had imagined possible. People he'd barely spoken to in years were volunteering their time, their expertise, their resources. The community that had seemed to be slowly dying was coming alive with shared purpose and determination. But it was Buckshot who provided the most tangible reminder of what they were fighting for. The dog had grown from a terrified puppy into a confident, intelligent companion who embodied everything good about rural life: loyalty, courage, the understanding that some things were worth protecting no matter the cost. Eli had been training him more intensively, building on the foundation Jake had established. Buckshot could now perform complex tasks that would have impressed any professional dog trainer, herding cattle with precision, detecting intruders from remarkable distances, and most importantly, providing the kind of emotional support that made even the darkest days bearable. He's not just a ranch dog anymore, Jake observed as they watched Buckshot demonstrate his latest skills for Sarah and Martha. He's become a symbol of what this community can accomplish when people work together. The decisive town council meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and both sides were preparing for what everyone understood would be the crucial confrontation. The developers had hired a public relations firm to present their case, complete with glossy brochures and economic impact studies that promised prosperity and progress. They'd arranged for several community members who supported development to speak on their behalf. But Eli's coalition had advantages that money couldn't buy: the truth, documented evidence of deceptive practices, and the kind of grassroots organizing that could mobilize an entire community when fundamental values were at stake. Marcus wrote something in his journal that I keep thinking about. Eli said during their final planning session. He said that in any conflict, the side with the strongest sense of purpose usually wins, even when they're outgunned and outnumbered. Purpose gives you the strength to keep fighting when everything seems hopeless. As he spoke, Buckshot lifted his head from his favorite spot by the radiator and looked directly at Eli, as if the dog understood that something important was about to happen. His expression was alert and confident, the same look he wore when he was working cattle or protecting the ranch from intruders. "What's our purpose?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "To protect what's ours," Eli said simply. "To honor the sacrifices of the people who built this community. To make sure that when our children and grandchildren ask what we did when our way of life was threatened, we can tell them we fought." Outside, the wind carried the scent of sage and wildflowers across the pastures, where 4 generations of Eli's family had worked and lived and died. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang the same song his great-grandfather had heard when he first claimed this land as home. Tomorrow would bring the battle that would determine whether that song would continue to echo across these fields, or whether it would be replaced by the sounds of machinery and development and the kind of progress that left nothing of the past intact. But tonight there was still time to prepare, to hope, and to believe that sometimes the right cause could overcome even the longest odds. The Copper Creek Community Center hadn't seen a crowd this large since the high school's championship basketball game in 1987. By 6 o'clock, every folding chair was occupied, people lined the walls, and latecomers spilled out onto the front steps, straining to hear through the open windows. The usual monthly town council meeting, typically attended by a dozen civic-minded residents discussing road maintenance and snow removal budgets, had transformed into something approaching a town hall revival. Eli sat in the 3rd row, his grandfather's pocket watch heavy in his vest pocket like a talisman from a simpler time. The watch had been carried by 3 generations of Boone men through wars, economic hardships, and family crises, its steady tick-tick-tick, a reminder that some things endured beyond individual struggles. He'd wound it carefully that morning, feeling the ritual connection to the men who had faced their own impossible battles, and somehow found the strength to prevail. Buckshot lay quietly at his feet, officially present as a service animal, but really serving as Eli's anchor to the present moment. The dog's calm presence had become essential to Eli's sense of balance, a living reminder that courage often came in unexpected packages and that loyalty was earned through consistency rather than grand gestures. At the front of the room, Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order with the nervous energy of a man who understood that his next few decisions might define his political legacy. Behind him sat the 5-member town council, local business owners and retirees who had volunteered for civic duty, expecting to debate zoning variances and parade permits, not navigate the future of their entire community. The developers had arrived with what Jake would have called overwhelming force, a team of lawyers, public relations specialists, and economic consultants armed with presentation materials that must have cost more than the town's annual budget. Their lead representative, a silver-haired man named Charles Blackwood, exuded the confident authority of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of charm, pressure, and sheer financial leverage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood began, his voice carrying easily through the packed room, "we're here tonight to discuss an opportunity that could transform Copper Creek from a struggling rural community into a thriving center of economic activity. Our development proposal represents over $100 million in investment, hundreds of new jobs, and a tax base that could fund infrastructure improvements you've only dreamed about." His presentation was polished and professional, complete with computer-generated renderings of the proposed Heritage Village development that would supposedly preserve the area's Western character while providing modern amenities. The images showed neat subdivisions with names like Homestead Ridge and Pioneer's Rest, shopping centers designed to look like frontier main streets, and recreational facilities that bore no resemblance to the actual landscape they would replace. Several community members spoke in favor of the development, including Tom Bradley, who presented economic arguments about property values and retirement, security that sounded rehearsed. Mrs. Patterson, from the grocery store, talked about the challenges of keeping businesses viable in a declining population, and young Danny Morrison expressed frustration about the lack of local opportunities for people his age. But as the evening progressed, it became clear that the room was more divided than the developers had anticipated. Martha Henderson spoke passionately about the importance of preserving rural communities and agricultural traditions. Dr. Martinez questioned the environmental impact studies and wondered aloud about the true costs of rapid development. Buck Morrison, despite his natural inclination toward compromise, expressed concerns about the strain on local emergency services and infrastructure. When Mayor Thompson finally called on Eli to speak, the room fell into the kind of respectful silence that communities reserve for their elders and war veterans. He stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, and reached into his pocket to touch his grandfather's watch. The familiar weight of the timepiece seemed to steady his nerves and clarify his thoughts. "My name is Eli Boone," he began, his voice carrying clearly to the back of the room, despite the tremor he felt in his chest. "My family has farmed this land for 4 generations, since before this town existed, since before most of your families came to this valley. I'm not here tonight to stand in the way of progress or to deny anyone the chance at a better life." He paused, letting his gaze move across the faces of neighbors he'd known for decades, people who had shared births and deaths and the 1,000 small joys and sorrows that bound communities together. "But I'm here to tell you that Mr. Blackwood and his associates haven't been entirely honest about their intentions. The development they're proposing is just the beginning. What they really want is what's underneath our land, mineral deposits worth more than all their housing developments combined." A murmur ran through the crowd as Eli continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "They've been conducting secret geological surveys on private property without permission. They've intimidated landowners and manipulated information to keep us from understanding the true value of what we own. This isn't development, it's exploitation." Sarah stood from her seat near the back of the room, holding up a thick folder of documents. "We have evidence of these surveys, geological reports showing significant mineral deposits, and documentation of the deceptive practices Mr. Blackwood's consortium has been using to acquire land at below-market prices." The developer's calm facade began to crack. Blackwood's face flushed red as he stood to respond, his voice losing its practiced smoothness. "These allegations are completely unfounded, designed to create fear and confusion. We've operated entirely within legal boundaries, and any suggestions otherwise are documented in your own geological surveys," Jake interrupted, standing beside Sarah with his own folder of evidence. "Surveys that were conducted without landowner consent, in violation of state and federal regulations governing mineral exploration." The room erupted in angry voices as neighbors turned to each other, some demanding explanations, others expressing outrage at what they were hearing. Blackwood attempted to regain control of the narrative, but his corporate speak responses only made him sound more evasive and manipulative. It was then that Buckshot proved his worth in ways Eli had never anticipated. As the arguments grew more heated and Blackwood's associates began making what sounded like thinly veiled threats about legal consequences for anyone who interfered with their development plans, the dog sensed the rising tension and moved to place himself protectively between Eli and the developers. Buckshot's positioning was subtle but unmistakable, a reminder that some threats didn't require words to be understood, and that loyalty came from the heart rather than the wallet. His calm presence seemed to steady the room, providing a focal point for the emotions swirling through the packed community center. "The bottom line is simple," Eli said, his hand resting on Buckshot's head as the room gradually quieted. "We have a choice to make tonight. We can trust outsiders who have already proven they're willing to lie to us, or we can trust each other. We can preserve what our families built here, or we can let it be destroyed for someone else's profit." Mayor Thompson called for order as the crowd pressed forward, some supporting Eli's position, others demanding answers from the developers. In the chaos that followed, it became clear that the evening had fundamentally changed the dynamics of the conflict. The battle for Copper Creek was just beginning, but for the first time since the fight started, Eli felt like his side might actually have a chance to win. The story broke in the Denver Post 3 days after the town hall meeting, under the headline, "Corporate Land Grab Exposed in Rural Colorado Community." Mike Thompson, the investigative journalist Jake had recruited, had done his homework thoroughly, cross-referencing the geological surveys with property records, tracking shell companies back to their parent corporations, and documenting a pattern of deceptive practices that extended far beyond Copper Creek. The article painted a devastating picture of corporate malfeasance, secret mineral surveys conducted without landowner consent, systematic misinformation campaigns designed to depress property values, and coordinated efforts to exploit legal loopholes that would allow developers to acquire surface rights while retaining access to valuable mineral deposits. The story included quotes from Amanda Chen, the geological engineer who had blown the whistle on the scheme, providing first-hand testimony about the pressure she'd faced to participate in what she knew was unethical behavior. By noon, the story had been picked up by television stations in Denver and Colorado Springs. By evening, it was trending on social media platforms, shared by environmental groups, property rights advocates, and rural communities facing similar pressures. Across the American West, the David versus Goliath narrative of a small farming community standing up to corporate exploitation resonated with people who had never heard of Copper Creek but understood the broader struggle it represented. Eli watched the coverage from his kitchen table, Buckshot at his feet and Sarah beside him, marveling at how quickly their private battle had become a public cause. The phone had been ringing constantly, reporters wanting interviews, lawyers offering to represent them pro bono, and activists from other communities seeking advice about their own fights against corporate land grabs. "Marcus would have loved this," Sarah said, during a brief lull in the media attention. "He always believed that standing up for what's right was worth any amount of trouble it might cause." The legal victory came faster than anyone had expected. Tom Rodriguez, the military lawyer Jake had recruited, had filed an emergency injunction to prevent any further development activities pending a full investigation into the mineral rights ownership. The evidence they'd gathered, the geological surveys, documentation of the deceptive practices, and testimony from Amanda Chen proved overwhelming. On Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the explosive town hall meeting, Judge Patricia Morales issued a comprehensive ruling that not only confirmed Eli's ownership of both surface and mineral rights, but also imposed significant financial penalties on Mountain West Holdings for their violations of state mining regulations. The decision established legal precedents that would protect other rural landowners from similar exploitation schemes. But perhaps more importantly, the ruling came with an unexpected windfall. The court ordered penalties, combined with damages for the unauthorized surveys and the costs of legal defense, amounted to nearly $2 million, enough to ensure that Eli could keep his ranch operating indefinitely, while also providing seed money for community development. Projects that would benefit all of Copper Creek. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me this is all a dream," Eli confided to Jake as they read through the legal documents that officially transferred the penalty payments to his account. "6 months ago, I was ready to give up on everything. Now I feel like I've got more purpose than I know what to do with." Jake smiled, a genuine expression of contentment that had been rare since his return from deployment. Funny how that works. Sometimes finding something worth fighting for is the best therapy there is. The transformation in Jake had been remarkable to witness. The nervous energy and hypervigilance that had marked his early struggles with civilian life had gradually given way to focused purpose and genuine peace. His work, organizing the community resistance, had provided exactly the kind of meaningful mission he'd been missing since leaving the military. And his success in the fight had restored his confidence in his own abilities. "I've been thinking about staying in Copper Creek permanently," Jake admitted. "Maybe starting a non-profit that helps rural communities organize against corporate exploitation. There are a lot of places facing what we faced, and not all of them have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively." The celebration at Eli's ranch the following Saturday drew nearly the entire population of Copper Creek, along with supporters from neighboring communities and even a few reporters who had driven out from Denver to cover the human interest angle of their victory. Tables laden with potluck dishes filled the front yard, children played games on the lawn, and an impromptu band of local musicians provided entertainment from the front porch. Buckshot had become the unofficial mascot of the celebration, accepting attention from dozens of admirers while maintaining the dignified composure of a dog who understood his importance to the community's success. Several families had already approached Eli about breeding rights, hoping to raise puppies with similar intelligence and loyalty. "He's gone from unwanted auction item to town celebrity," Martha Henderson observed, watching Buckshot pose patiently for photos with a group of children. "That dog's got more sense than most politicians." As the afternoon stretched into evening and the crowd began to thin, Eli found himself sitting on his front steps with Sarah, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. It was the same view he'd contemplated during his darkest days of grief and isolation. But everything about his perspective had changed. "I keep thinking about that morning when you showed up with the divorce papers," he said quietly. "How empty everything felt, how impossible it seemed that life could ever be good again." Sarah took his hand, a gesture that felt both familiar and new. "We were both drowning then. Losing Marcus broke something in both of us, and we didn't know how to help each other heal. But we found our way back. We found our way forward," she corrected gently. "We're not the same people we were before we lost him. We can't be. But maybe we're people he would have been proud of." The new land deed sat framed on the mantel inside, official documentation that the Boone family's ownership of their ancestral property was secure for generations to come. But the real victory wasn't legal or financial. It was the understanding that home was more than just a place you owned. It was a place where you belonged, where you contributed, where your life had meaning beyond your own survival. As the last guests departed and the cleanup began, Eli realized that the broken-down widower who had bought a frightened puppy for $1 no longer existed. In his place stood a man who had rediscovered his purpose, his community, and his capacity for hope. The ranch that had once felt like a beautiful prison had become the foundation for a life worth living. And the dog who had led him to buried treasure had taught him the most valuable lesson of all. Sometimes salvation comes in the smallest packages, and sometimes the act of saving someone else is exactly what you need to save yourself. 6 months later, the October auction at Murphy's Bar and Grill buzzed with the kind of energy that comes from a community that has rediscovered its sense of purpose. The monthly gathering had grown substantially since the spring, drawing people from neighboring towns who had heard about Copper Creek's successful stand against corporate exploitation. What had once been a modest local event had become something approaching a regional institution. Eli stood at the edge of the crowd, watching Buck Morrison work the auctioneer's platform with his usual enthusiasm. But this time, the atmosphere felt fundamentally different. The desperate quality that had marked previous auctions, people selling possessions they couldn't afford to keep, had been replaced by genuine celebration. Families were donating items they'd outgrown, rather than selling necessities to pay bills. And the proceeds would fund the new community center that Jake's non-profit organization was building. Buckshot sat beside him, no longer the terrified puppy of 8 months ago, but a confident, mature dog whose offspring were already showing signs of inheriting his intelligence and loyalty. 3 of his puppies had gone to families in town. One was training with the sheriff's department as a search and rescue dog, and 2 remained on Eli's ranch as working partners for their father. The transformation in the dog paralleled the transformation in everything else. What had once been broken and abandoned had become the foundation for something stronger and more beautiful. "You thinking about bidding on anything today?" Sarah asked, appearing at his elbow with 2 cups of coffee and the easy familiarity that had returned to their relationship over the past several months. They'd remarried in August in a simple ceremony on the ranch, with Buckshot serving as unofficial ring bearer and half the town in attendance. It wasn't the same marriage they'd had before. That naive certainty about the future was gone forever, but it was deeper, more resilient, built on the understanding that love required daily choice rather than just initial commitment. "Maybe," Eli replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Jake mentioned there might be some ranch equipment up for bid today. Nothing I need, but it's good to support the cause." The cause was the Copper Creek Community Development Fund, established with a portion of the settlement money from the lawsuit against Mountain West Holdings. The fund provided low-interest loans for local businesses, scholarships for young people pursuing agricultural education, and grants for infrastructure improvements that would help the town thrive without sacrificing its rural character. Jake managed the program with the same systematic approach he'd brought to their fight against the developers, treating community development as a long-term strategic mission rather than a series of random good intentions. "Speaking of Jake," Sarah said, nodding toward the platform, where their friend was helping Buck manage the increasingly complex logistics of the auction. "Have you seen him this happy since he's been back?" Eli followed her gaze and smiled at what he saw. Jake Morrison had found his calling in community organizing and veteran outreach, using his military experience to help other rural communities resist corporate exploitation, while also providing support services for returning soldiers who struggled with civilian life. The nervous energy that had marked his early days home from deployment had been replaced by focused purpose and genuine contentment. "He's found his mission," Eli said. "Sometimes that's all a man needs to make sense of everything else." The first items of the day moved quickly. Household goods, furniture, the usual assortment of useful objects that changed hands at every auction. But when Buck announced the day's special items, Eli's attention sharpened with interest. "Now, folks, we've got something a little different today," Buck called out, his voice carrying easily over the crowd. "The Henderson estate has donated this beautiful border collie mix, about 6 months old, house-trained and ready for a working home. She's been living with elderly Mrs. Patterson since her nephew moved to the city. But she needs more activity than a town lot can provide." The puppy that appeared on the platform was beautiful, black and white with intelligent eyes and the alert posture that marked working breeds. But Eli could see something else in her demeanor. A wariness that spoke of uncertainty about her place in the world. She wasn't traumatized like Buckshot had been, but she was definitely a dog in transition, needing someone who would give her purpose and belonging. "Do I hear $50 to start the bidding?" Buck asked. Several hands went up immediately. This was a different kind of auction crowd than the one that had witnessed Buckshot's rescue. People who understood the value of good working dogs and were prepared to pay accordingly. The bidding quickly rose to $200, then $300, as ranchers and farmers competed for what was clearly a quality animal. Eli watched the proceedings with interest, but no intention of participating. His ranch already had more dogs than it strictly needed, and Sarah had made it clear that their animal population was not going to expand further without serious discussion. But then he noticed something that made him reconsider. A young man at the back of the crowd, probably no more than 25, was watching the bidding with obvious longing, but wasn't participating. He had the look of someone who wanted something desperately, but knew he couldn't afford it. The same expression Eli had probably worn during his own lean years as a young rancher. $400, called out Pete Jensen, recently returned to ranching after the unexpected success of his rebuilt hardware store. $450, countered Maria Gonzalez, whose sheep operation had been thriving since the development threat disappeared. The young man at the back looked increasingly dejected as the price climbed beyond his reach. Eli found himself studying the stranger's face, seeing something familiar in the combination of determination and disappointment. This was someone who understood the value of what was being offered, but lacked the resources to compete for it. Going once at $450, Buck announced. Do I hear 500? Eli's hand went up before he'd consciously decided to bid. 500. Sarah gave him a questioning look, but he was already committed to whatever impulse had driven his participation. The bidding continued for a few more rounds, but eventually the other competitors dropped out, leaving Eli as the successful bidder at $650. As he made his way to the platform to collect his purchase, the young man approached with obvious confusion. "Excuse me, sir," he said hesitantly. "I think there might have been some mistake. I mean, I'm glad the dog's going to a good home, but you thought maybe you'd like to have a working partner." Eli finished for him. "What's your name, son?" "David Chen. I just leased the old Morrison place north of town, planning to start a small cattle operation. I've been looking for a good stock dog, but good dogs cost more than you budgeted for," Eli said, understanding the situation completely. "Been there myself. What do you think about earning this dog instead of buying her?" The arrangement they worked out over coffee at Murphy's was simple and mutually beneficial. David would work part-time on Eli's ranch, learning advanced cattle management techniques while earning credit toward the dog's purchase price. The puppy, renamed Scout in honor of Marcus's childhood companion, would split her time between both operations, gaining experience with different types of livestock and management styles. "You don't have to do this," David said, his voice thick with gratitude. "I mean, I appreciate it more than I can say, but—" "Son," Eli interrupted gently, "8 months ago, someone showed me kindness when I needed it most. Sometimes the best way to honor a gift is to pass it on." That evening, as they drove home, with Scout sleeping peacefully in the back seat between Buckshot and one of his offspring, Sarah reached over and took Eli's hand. "That was a good thing you did today," she said. "Marcus would have approved." They pulled into the ranch driveway as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Eli why his great-grandfather had chosen this particular piece of earth to call home. The house lights were warm and welcoming, the cattle were settled in the near pasture, and smoke rose from the chimney of the small cabin they'd built for Jake when he decided to make his stay permanent. Behind the house, in the small memorial garden they'd created over the summer, a new headstone marked Marcus's final resting place. The polished granite bore his name, his dates, and the simple inscription, "Beloved son, faithful soldier, forever home." But what made the memorial special was the small bronze plaque beside it, bearing the impression of Buckshot's paw print and the words, "In memory of all who serve." It had been Sarah's idea to include Buckshot in the memorial, recognizing that the dog's journey from abandonment to belonging paralleled their own path from grief to healing. The memorial garden had become a place of peace rather than sorrow, somewhere they could remember Marcus while celebrating the life that continued around them. As they walked toward the house with their expanded pack of dogs trailing behind them, Eli reflected on the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A dollar bid on an unwanted puppy had led to the exposure of corporate fraud, the preservation of a community, the rebuilding of a marriage, and the discovery that purpose could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, David Chen to train, community projects to oversee, the ongoing work of building something sustainable from the victory they'd achieved. But tonight, there was the simple satisfaction of knowing that home was more than just a place you defended. It was a place where you created possibilities for others to flourish. In the kitchen window, the evening light caught the framed photograph of Marcus in his army uniform. The young man's smile, a reminder that some legacies live on through the choices made by those who remember. And curled up on his favorite rug by the radiator, Buckshot opened one eye to check on his expanding family before settling back into the contented sleep of a dog who knew exactly where he belonged. The ranch that had once echoed with loneliness now hummed with purpose. And the man who had thought his story was ending discovered that sometimes the most important chapters are the ones you never saw coming.